Today, Dr. Jihye Kwan, who is the Associate Director for Survey Research at the USC Race and Equity Center and an adjunct professor in the Rossier School of Education. For more than a decade, the Race and Equity Center has aimed to dismantle racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness in all their forms. Our work spans three areas: K-12 schools and districts, colleges and universities, and businesses and firms. For the last 4 years, educators have faced greater public scrutiny and systematic censorship than the previous 3 decades for discussing race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality in K-12 schools, colleges, and universities, and their workplaces. Last spring, our center released a 62-page report authored by 12 highly respected equity experts called Truths About DEI on College Campuses, which noted that more than 100 legislative bills in 44 states have been introduced to restrict, censor, or ban altogether diversity, equity, and identity-conscious schooling. 18 states have banned the spending of public funds on DEI-related activities in K-12 schools. 8 states have banned DEI activities in colleges and universities. Since President Trump's inauguration in January, over 60 executive orders have been issued, including those that explicitly target diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, initiatives, and policies in K-12 schools and higher education. In holding this event today, we continue to provide a forum for discussing the lived experiences, benefits, and seminal contributions of educational equity experts, including today's featured author, Dr. OiYan Poon. More than 300 people across the nation registered for today's Equity Book Talk event, which is a strong indication of its importance and educators' needs for guidance in this moment. We're hoping our Equity Book Talk series with renowned experts like Dr. Poon will help educators hold ourselves and each other accountable to the everyday work of anti-racism, to stop traumatizing and undermining educators and students seeking to create more inclusive and equitable classrooms, and to move beyond mere gestures of allyship. As I said earlier, today's session is being recorded, and you can activate the closed captioning feature by using a Zoom dashboard on your screen and clicking the caption feature. Following our interview with Dr. Poon, you will be invited to ask some questions. So don't hesitate, don't be shy. We look forward to engaging with you. You can use the chat, and we'll invite you to come on camera, off mute, and speak directly with Dr. Poon. Please, again, use the chat in the meantime, and we'll do our best to address your questions in the time remaining. Dr. Jihye Kwan is going to take it from here. Dr. Kwan.
Thank you, Dr. Pascalala. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this important conversation on the book Asian American is Not a Color with Dr. OiYan Poon. I'm Jihye Kwan, Associate Director for Survey Research. I'm an honor to be moderating today's discussion with an audience of educators, both in K-12 and also higher education, who are deeply invested in equity, inclusion, and also nuanced experience of Asian American students and community. Dr. OiYan Poon is an acclaimed scholar, educator, and advocate for racial justice in education field. Dr. Poon is the author of Rethinking College Admissions and Difficult Subject, Insight and Strategy for Teaching About Race, Sexuality, and Gender, and recently published a new book, Asian American is Not a Color, Conversations on Race, Affirmative Action, and Family. Her work focused on the interaction of race, education, and policy, with a particular emphasis on Asian American experiences. Dr. Poon has been a vocal proponent of affirmative action and has published extensively on this subject, contributing to national conversation about race and equity in education. So before we start with the question that John and I have prepared today, I would like to invite Dr. Poon for her presentation about introducing herself and also the book, the main theme, which will be the starting section of book talk today. Dr. Poon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwan and Dr. Pascarella. It's an honor for me to join you all today in community. I'm joining you from Chicago, my favorite city in the world, and really delighted, even as a UCLA Bruin alum, to join you all at USC. We are all in this together for sure in this moment. So I want to start by giving a brief presentation to share a little bit about what this book was all about, the origin story behind why I wrote this book and everything. So first of all, thank you so much, the USC Race Center, and Jihei and John. I want to share that, you know, we are living, just to acknowledge, we are living in a really challenging time, especially for those of us who care about racial justice and equity and access and opportunity in education and higher education. This book really, as I'll share, I wrote it as a window. I feel like affirmative action is not really fully center of this book. It's really, I think the book provides an analysis or narratives and storytelling and a window into this debate over race-conscious college admissions to give us an understanding about a couple of things. One, Asian American identity. What exactly is it? It's certainly contested. It's diverse. It's quite frankly all over the place, as I'll share a bit. Secondly, I think the story behind the conflicts and the affirmative action divide among Asian Americans really tells us a lot about the politics of resistance in 2025. I did these interviews in 2016, as I'll share, but I think there's a lot of things that I learned that are very relevant to today. And, you know, a reporter about a month or two ago asked me if saving diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education just requires the changing of a name, right? Do we just stop saying DEI, stop saying diversity, equity, inclusion? And I was like, you know, I've been thinking a lot about that question a lot. Number one, I started my career 25 years ago in something called multicultural student affairs, minority student services and programs. So we have been changing names, but the name that hasn't fully come back into focus, and I think we absolutely need to do this now, is we need to trace the lineage of diversity, equity, inclusion programs back to efforts towards desegregation. And so what we're battling over is the continuation of a conflict over who belongs in our public institutions and public civic leadership. And you know, whether we get to, it's this battle really over essentially, do we get to continue to fight for achieving a dream of a diverse democracy, a multiracial democracy, or are we going to go backwards into fully descending into what I'm calling kind of in this moment a neo-apartheid state? So we need to get clear on that. So let me get into this book. As Jihei
Doc-
mentioned, oh,
Dr. Poon, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're seeing your full presenter notes view
ah,
on the, so I tried with messenger
yeah,
you. I just wanted
thank you.
to, okay, great.
There
There
we
we
go.
go.
Yes.
There we
Thank you
go.
so
Thank
much.
you so much. So as I was saying, as Jihei introduced me, right, really, my research has followed two lines of research. One is has been, why do Asian Americans feel all different kind of ways about affirmative action? You know, so really diving into that. But then also the second line of research that emerged from that was, how exactly does college admissions work? And so those systems, and so I was a good researcher, a faculty member. I gained tenure on this line of work. I've been working in this area for, you know, almost 2 decades now. I co-led the authoring of an amicus brief to the Supreme Court defending race-conscious admissions in SFFA versus Harvard, and supported my colleagues who did the same in the UNC case to the Supreme Court. But as I have found out time and time again, evidence is very, unfortunately, doesn't have the power that we wish it did in this moment. So why did I write this book? This is a picture on the left of my daughter, Tay when she was 3 years old. She was in preschool at the time, and this is in 2018. So during the first Trump administration, and my daughter asked me, "Mom, are we Black or are we white?" And this is how I open the book. The book is written entirely as letters to my daughter, Tay, who is now almost 10 years old. And these letters to my daughter frame the research that I did and the stories, because the research project itself was a narrative inquiry project. So a lot of the stories that I share throughout the book offer insights into the diversity of the Asian American community and these racial politics around education, framed with these conversations that my daughter and I have been having since she was 3 years old. So at that time when she was 3, she asked, "Mom, are we Black or are we white?" And I said, "Oh, we're neither. I said, well, we're Asian American." And I think I was cooking dinner one night in 2018 when she was asking me this. And I was just like, oh, wow, it's our first mommy and daughter race conversation. I knew this would happen, but I had no idea that, this would start happening when she was a toddler. But if I was to dig into my education research knowledge, then I would know, of course, toddlers and babies start thinking about these things very early on in life, right? And so we as parents and educators need to be prepared to help them think through these things. Well, to my surprise, when I said, "Baby, we're Asian American," Tay said to me, "But Mom, Asian American's not a color," right? And it was just a really poignant moment that got me thinking. I'm a higher ed scholar. I have no idea how to talk to a toddler about race. I've been studying race and ethnicity and racism systems and how to change these systems for decades, and I don't know how to talk to my child about these things. And it got me thinking about these anti-diversity equity curriculum parents out there, like Moms for Liberty. How are they talking to their children about these things? Because surely my daughter is not alone in her wonderings, as research has demonstrated to us time and again. And so I decided at that moment that I would challenge myself to write a book to my daughter. If anyone has written anything before, you know that a big part of writing something is to figure out who your audience was and is for your writing. And so I decided it was going to be my daughter. And so that's what the book is, how the book is framed. So next I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research itself. So back in 2013, those of you in California may remember something called SCA 5, Senate Constitution Amendment 5. It was proposed in the state legislature to repeal Proposition 209, the state ban on affirmative action. So I have this picture in the top left corner of a protest of mostly Chinese immigrant communities who were protesting SCA 5. And you see these 2 young children holding a sign saying, "I study hard, do not reject me into UC because of my race." And then also this picture on the bottom left, which is a protest in Boston during the Harvard trial, the initial oral arguments at the district court level. And at the time, this is about a little over 10 years ago now, these people confused me. I also identify as Chinese, like these people who are pictured, but I didn't find them to be very familiar. And I thought they were just, the arguments they were making just didn't make any sense to me. And I was complaining about these, but at the same time, even though I was complaining about their arguments, I was really surprised to see this political mobilization, because if you know anything about immigrant and Asian American research on Asian American civic engagement, this population is not very politically engaged. And so to see this direct action from this segment of the community was surprising. And so a colleague of mine, Peter King, in 2015, as I was complaining to him, probably at AERA, about these protests, he asked me, "Have you ever spoken with Asian Americans protesting affirmative action?" And I was like, why would I do that? But the question, again, like my daughter's question, really stuck with me. And I decided to go ahead and use my skill sets and interview people across the country, spend time with folks who identify as Asian American across the country on why they either oppose or support affirmative action. So the pictures on the left represent some of the folks, that represent ideologies or perspectives against affirmative action. And the picture on the right is outside of the Supreme Court in 2022. And you see a very diverse, racially diverse group of mostly younger people. They kind of represent the energy and that the supporters really bring, right? So in total, I spent time with 36 individuals on the East Coast, the West Coast, and in Chicagoland. And what I found was that the opponents were, my colleagues and I were unable to find anyone who identified as non-Chinese Asian to interview with us. Now, that's not to say there's no non-Chinese Asians who oppose affirmative action, but our approach was we were inviting people who were either leaders or key members of Asian American identified organizations to interview with us, that they were part of organizations that were supporting or opposed to affirmative action. And so it was really pulling teeth to find any Asian American to interview with us to say that they opposed affirmative action. And then the folks that we interviewed, all of them who opposed identified mostly as, they were all Chinese ethnically identified. They were all but one identified as a man. And the majority of them were first-generation immigrants. On the other side, the affirmative action supporters, they were ethnically diverse, gender identity diverse, sexuality diverse, class diversity. There was class diversity, you name it. There was just a broad swath of identities. And a big difference that I found was that the opponents had very segregated lives, right? Their social and professional lives and their immigration pathways were very segregated. They arrived, most of them arrived on H-1B professional visas or entered grad school here in the United States from China. And they skipped over the ethnic enclaves, whereas the Asian Americans identified who supported affirmative action had very diverse social connections, professional spaces. They were more exposed to a diversity of folks. So that's a little bit about the people I talked to. So what did I find? What I learned was misinformation is pervasive. Of course, in 2025, saying misinformation is pervasive is kind of like a well, duh, right? But at the time in 2016, I was learning how deeply pervasive it was in particularly these communities of folks that I was talking with. But perhaps it's not just related to Asian American communities. In fact, I don't think it is specific to Asian American communities. There were two questions that I asked that I thought were kind of throwaway questions when I interviewed folks. The first one is represented by this pie chart on the left. I asked folks, well, tell me in your words, what is affirmative action? And the majority of the people, both supporters and opponents, so 30 of the 36 people told me affirmative action is a racial quota, or affirmative action is a point bonus system if you check off the right demographic box. And in my head, I was like, no, that's actually not it. So then the supporters would say, well, quotas are necessary because of the centuries of systemic exclusion and racism. And the opponents would say quotas are unfair, right? And in both cases, I was like, you're wrong. And then the follow-up question I asked them was, what is your ideal system of college admissions? And 33 of the 36 people, now again, across differences in opinion on the policy itself, 33 of 36 people said, basically described to me race-conscious holistic admissions. All right, so it was an eye-opener to realize that people didn't really quite, were not really clear on what they were fighting about, debating over about. And so I started wondering, is it just a matter of correcting information? Will that fix the clarity in the debate and conversation? But then I started thinking and connecting things to Asian American history and racial history in the United States. And I think that what I realized was that there is a framing difference in this affirmative action divide. So again, I have the picture on the left from the Supreme Court of affirmative action supporters. And I describe generally their positioning, their framing of racial politics and education as one of justice, solidarity, and abundance. And on the right, we have what I've been calling just us, an approach of just us, individualism, and scarcity, right? And so I have this other picture here on the right here. It's from New York City, outside of an education town hall that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez held in 2019. And you see this man holding a sign that says equity, a code word for anti-Asian. And I didn't get to interview these people, though someday I would love to interview these folks. I posted this picture on my Facebook at the time, and a friend of mine just said, oh my gosh, these are my neighbors. The man in the red jacket and the man holding the sign, she said to me, you know, one of them was a freedom fighter in Tiananmen Square, pro-democracy activist. And the other one was an LGBTQ rights activist. And both of them, because of their political freedom fighting in mainland China, are both now political dissidents and cannot go back to China. Right. So it really boggles the mind in some ways to think about how in one context you have freedom fighters, and in this other context, you're calling equity a code word for anti-Asian. And I think it really underscores something that I really talk about in this book, which is, I think in a lot of ways, the affirmative action opponents feel somewhat gaslit by the rhetoric around racial equity in education. They don't feel included. And so they're kind of acting out, and they're also not fully connected to the historical context of race and racism, because if they were, they would understand that actually these two positions, these two framings, justice, solidarity, and abundance on one hand, and just us, individualism and scarcity, have historical antecedents. So I talk about in the book litigious Asian ancestors. And so on the left, under justice, solidarity, and abundance, I won't go through these cases, but please feel free to look them up. They really historically have demonstrated this idea of engaging in projects against racism that really changed the game. There's Wong Kim Ark, who has been in the news lately again around birthright citizenship because of that recent executive order. The Lau versus Nichols case around bilingual education. I also talk about the originators of the Asian American movement and Asian American studies, alongside the Third World Liberation movement and ethnic studies moves in higher education that have transformed higher education, changing the entire game, right, and systems. On the right, with just us, individualism and scarcity, our litigious Asian ancestors include Ozawa, Thind, and Lum. Ozawa and Thind, one Japanese, one Indian, sued the United States government for the right to naturalize as US citizens, because at the time, this is 100 years ago, the United States said you could only naturalize as a US citizen if you were white or if you were African descendant, right? This goes back to Dred Scott, right? And then there's the Lum versus Rice case where, and so Ozawa and Thind both argued, hey, Ozawa argued he was white, and the court said, you're not white, we meant Caucasian. And Thind said, great, I'm Caucasian because I'm Indian, and the Caucasus are in northern India. And the court said, no, we meant white, you don't look white. So they both lost their cases. Similarly, Lum versus Rice, Lum also lost their case. Lum is the Lum case was basically a Chinese family in Mississippi in the 1920s. They wanted their daughters to go to the white school, right? So again, all three of these cases were cases that argued for projects of essentially assimilating into an unjust system, right? And so I think these cases and all of this has great relevance for us today. And I want to bring us to this quote, one of my favorites, and I quote her, Grace Lee Boggs, in my book on a lot of my talks quite often. She said, you don't choose the times you live in, but you do choose who you want to be, and you do choose how you want to think. Now, Grace Lee Boggs was born in 1915 here in the United States. She was I believe she was the first woman of color to receive a PhD in philosophy. She couldn't get a job. She was a longtime political activist, community activist in Detroit, and she passed away at 100 years old in 2015. A great community philosopher and activist. And so I've been thinking a lot again about this quote and a lot of Grace's work. And throughout the book, I think the main question I've been asking is, will we choose resistance projects for justice or just us? Because as you all know, we've got something, right? I mean, the SFFA court ruling is being used now and cited in the executive orders against diversity, equity, inclusion. It's being used to sue the University of California again. All of this could have predicted. I saw this coming, and it was really frustrating because in the original legal complaint by SFFA versus Harvard and UNC, what they were going for was not just the end of race-conscious admissions. And Ed Bloom was just interviewed in Inside Higher Education. What he and SFFA were really after is the end of any use of race or ethnicity in the educational setting. Ed Bloom was the one who propped up SFFA. Ed Bloom was the one who sued Harvard and UNC, not Asian American plaintiffs. And you see this now because Ed Bloom is also now, celebrating the Trump administration coming after diversity, equity, inclusion projects in higher education. My former employer at Colorado State University just started moves to reassign and reorganize and potentially shut down the various student cultural centers on the campus, including the Asian Pacific American Cultural Center, right? So to say that it's disingenuous, to say the least, for the Trump administration to say that shutting down diversity, equity, inclusion is for Asian Americans. But we are here, they are using these racial stereotypes, and they're counting on people to not understand and to understand how Asian Americans fit in all of this. So my hope, and what I write to my daughter, is that I hope we continually expand our analysis and what we dream for beyond narrow individual wins. I was sharing earlier with John that I'm nervous that some folks will be more than happy to throw under the bus diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives on our campuses in order to continue getting their research grants. And we're seeing a lot of colleges and universities capitulate. Thankfully, there are allies out there and organizations that are, putting up a fight, like NADAHE is putting up a fight. They filed a complaint against the Trump administration. There is an injunction on the executive order to cut or freeze equity-related contracts right now, and that came out on Friday. And so I think in this moment right now, we really need to think about, yes, we have to defend what we have, but we also have to think about how are we going to play offense as well, because we've been playing whole lot of defense for many, many years. And I personally am ready to play some offense. And I think that really the biggest lesson and theme throughout the book that I hope my daughter and others take away is that we can only thrive together. We don't win alone. And so I'm grateful to be here in community with you all. Thank you, and excited to be in conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Poon. It was very I was hearing, it was touching that like you start how you decided to write this book, your motivation, and then the main message that you are trying to sort of convey. And then you interview with so many Asian American people like who have a different opinion on this affirmative action. Now we have a few questions for you based on your book. And I'll start, and then John can also answer a few questions he had afterwards. So first question I have is that as student of color, the Asian American student, what unique challenges they get to face in this country? And that's the first question. And then follow-up question is actually related to the recent Dear Colleagues letter from the Department of Education on February 14th. So in the document, the acting assistant secretary for civil rights wrote this sentence. In recent years, American educational institutions have discriminated against students on the basis of race, including white and Asian students, many of whom come from disadvantaged background and low-income families. So while I was reading that document, I would love to talk to you about this particular sentence and also love to hear from your thoughts. And I think you probably have like a lot of knowledge and thought on the unique challenges that Asian American and Asian American students have in this society. So it'll be great if you can share your thought on that issue.
Yeah, so I see my former student Peter Lim Tongvarat is actually in the audience, and I wish he could just like share contemporarily. But you know, I think on a basic level, right, we often do not speak about Asian American students because it's just such a statistically speaking, there's just such a bimodality in terms of Asian American, just on the narrow metrics of academics, right? Even just starting there, right? Oftentimes when we talk about equity in education, we go directly to attainment stats, right? And these descriptive stats tell us something, but I don't think they tell us everything, right? And so when you have a diversity of Asian Americans too, you have a wide swath of ethnic groups that have very different immigration pathways, refugee experiences, class inequalities. You know, time and time again, the research and demographic data across the country shows us that you have, you know, very wealthy Asian Americans and very, you know, high educational attainment among Asian Americans. You also have Asian Americans who are also at the lowest spectrum of the socioeconomic status bands, right? But because the way averages work, right, we squish them all together and then you've got something in the middle that looks very good, right? And so I think just on that alone, oftentimes you don't get a lot of further analysis, right? And so I think the further analysis that's needed is, you know, when I was a student affairs professional 25 years ago at UC Davis, we were talking about a mental health crisis among Asian American students. I was just at UC Davis last week, and faculty and colleagues were telling me that they were dealing with a mental health crisis among Asian American students, but it doesn't really get discussed. And of course, with mental health and death by suicide, that's not something that often will get discussed. So there's that, right? There's just such a wide band of experiences. I will say that, you know, I think on a gendered level, there's a lot there as well. There's, you know, stats that in research on Asian American women and sexual assault at higher rates. And so it goes beyond there's the academics, and there are communities within Asian Americans that certainly could benefit from our institutions doing better in their performance to support and address their needs. But then there's also beyond academics too. There's a holistic human experience that goes oftentimes just completely neglected and under the radar for sure. So that's your first question. Any follow-ups or anything that you're seeing too? Because I'm no longer on a campus, so.
I think as a Asian who immigrated about 12 years ago to United States to pursue a degree, I also thought a lot about this unique challenges that we have in this country, that it's kind of hard to say, especially in the text of higher education, where a lot of Asian American students are high achieving. But one thing that I was thinking is that there are 44 different Asian countries. So it's not just China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan. It's not just those very developed country. But yeah, it's true that those people from those East Asia country are more likely to and more successful and highly educated. But then, as you mentioned, the mental health issues, sexual harassment, and then different types of racism that Asian is viewed as somewhat, I would say, inferior in this country. And then also that if we only talking about academic achievement, that's true. Maybe Asian are very high achieving, but not Southeast Asian student. It can be also opposite cases. They still need academic support and in addition to other types of support. So it's very complex, but it's so easy to just lump everyone and then say Asian doesn't need any help. And also the fact that there are a lot of successful Asian American students, it's not because they receive certain types of advantage because of their race in society, but because it's our own culture. Like very highly competitive, education is so important, peer pressure, pressure from family. That's the reason maybe they are like really good at like examination and stuff. So
I would also add, yeah, the culture argument comes up quite a bit. But we also need to think about the structural history of immigration policy as well, right? So college attainment rates in China is less than 3%. So Chinese people in China, less than 3% have a college degree, right? So then who are the people? We have something called a very selective immigration system here in the United States, right? And so then, as I was mentioning, why was it that I was interviewing so many people who were professional class immigrants? It's because most of them immigrated after 1990. And as you know, in the book, I talk about the Immigration Act in 1990 practically cut off, like almost squashed into very small numbers, family reunification pathways for immigration and really amped up the numbers of highly educated professional class folks from places, right? So then India's college attainment rate is very low, but Indian Americans in the United States have the highest college attainment rates in the country, right? So it's not just culture, because you would imagine culture would then mean, right? But it's also structure. So yeah, so then it's but and I think also, you raise the question of challenges, and I think at the end of the day, we were very much reminded, the last 5 years of just under the surface, right, of racial animosity, right? Even now, as I see colleagues who are researchers fighting to defend, getting IES and NSF and other federal research grants, one of the talking points is to basically, go talk to Republican Congresspeople and, raise up this kind of use an anti-China rhetoric, right? Which when I saw the talking point, I was like, I feel a little uncomfortable. Like, can we say like it's a Chinese government thing? Like, but it's like feeding right under the surface of, wow, look at this model minority, but there is an racial animus right underneath of it, right? So, and so it to your second question, right, about the Dear Colleague letter, there's been rapid legal analyses in the last week, about how there's really no teeth to, like, it's actually not, it doesn't hold the weight of law. And actually as you know, the Dear Colleague letter, it even says this Dear Colleague letter doesn't hold the weight of law, essentially, right? I'm summarizing now. So they admit in that, but it's this bullying effect, right? It's administering through bullying and terror to just basically say, if you want to get our Pell grants through your students, if you want to get these research grants with huge indirect lines, you know, you're going to do this. And it's such a chaotic environment right now too. And we're all going to hurt. Everyone's getting hurt, right, by this. And so it's really frustrating to have them say they're doing this in defense of Asian Americans and whites, when at the end of the day, shutting these programs down is going to hurt everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Poon. My next question is about solidity. How can Asian American community build strong coalitions with other racial ethnic group to sort of collectively advance racial justice? I know there's no easy, simple answer to the question, but I would love to hear from your thoughts, any suggestion on how we can all move forward together.
Yeah, so in the book, I provide a couple of examples of this. I've just been thinking a lot about local community organizing and really getting connected offline, right, in real life. I think some of the examples I talk about, my favorite example is actually here in Chicago, and I talk about this in the book. It's a Korean community center here in Chicago. And when I went to go interview the person I was interviewing, she was for Affirmative Action, and I walk into, and she was the executive director at the time of this community center. And I walked in thinking, okay, a Korean community center, I should be seeing Korean people, right? I saw Korean people, but I also saw young Black people in the center. And I was like, oh, not what I anticipated, but that's cool, right? And then I sat down with, I think I called her Minji, in the book. And I was like, yeah, tell me what's happening here. Like, this is not what I anticipated. And she said, oh yeah, we're the fiscal sponsor for Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100. And I was like, you are? I had no idea, right? And this is not something that they share. It's just the right thing to do, is what Minji would say, right? But so I asked her how, you know, I was like, oh, that's great, you're doing the right thing. And she was like, but it took a long time. What happened, it was a learning journey for their community, where every year this community center had a memorial event for the Gwangju uprising, where the authoritarian government in South Korea basically steamrolled with tanks pro-democracy student activists in 1980. And so every year they have this memorial at the center. And in I did these interviews in 2016. So in 2015, after many years of what the center called like a solidarity workshop, a solidarity learning series, they, for the Gwangju Memorial, they put up a picture, the typical pictures they had and photos and memorials of Gwangju next to photos of Ferguson, right? So where Michael Brown was shot and killed by a police officer, and there were protests in Ferguson. And the police and military came in. And so if you recall, there were pictures of police holding guns at young people. And so what Minji told me was, the moment the elders saw these pictures next to each other, they started crying. And they were sad, they were enraged that they came to this country thinking they wouldn't have to, that this is not a country that does this, right? But they were like, how is it that this is happening right here? And so then the board of the organization started asking, how do we work in solidarity? The elders took a bus to Ferguson. Can you imagine? Like, there were Korean elderly in Ferguson trying to provide mutual aid, you know, giving mutual aid to the young protesters, or the protesters in Ferguson and the organizers, right? And then they also decided, you know, we should be the fiscal sponsor for, you know, be in alliance with BYP 100 and do something locally too in Chicago to support. And so that's probably one of my favorite examples. There's so many. In LA, I mentioned Vigilant Love, which is a coalition between Japanese Americans and Muslim Americans. thinking about the history of internment, and then the Muslim ban, that's how that organization got founded. And they are still organizing today, of course. So lots of examples, but we just really need to take it back to building and connecting with each other.
Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful example, Dr. Poon. I'd like to mindful for our time. I would like to ask John. I would like to ask any question, although I have a few more.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwon and Dr. Poon. And you did an incredible job uh, pulling together in your presentation the landscape of the challenges that have come up and the misconceptions with respect to the purposes of affirmative action, the evidence with respect to community perspectives, and what does it mean to adopt a race-conscious understanding and promote understanding and dialogue through the research you've conducted. And so I just wanted to go to a few places in your text. We have a very short time remaining, and I would love the audience to have an opportunity to ask you questions as well. So I'll just foreground, I'll try to keep this short and foreground. If you're waiting to ask a question, please use the chat now. You can post your question in there, and we'll do our best to address it. And so I think what I would love to do is just point to a few passages in the book to give the audience some perspective if they haven't picked up the book yet. There were some really powerful passages that I certainly saw, and I invite Dr. Poon to spotlight some of those that she is compelled to share. I think that the first place I like to go is in chapter 2, commonalities across the affirmative action divide. On page 48, you reference these claims that race-conscious admissions policies are anti-Asian, rely on racially biased logics, racial anxieties, and two fallacies. The first myth is that all Asian Americans pursuing college degrees are extraordinarily talented, above and beyond other Americans. The second misconception is that all Asian Americans wish to attend highly selective colleges and universities. The first assumption relies on racial stereotypes of universal Asian American high achievement and negative racial stereotypes of other students of color, measured solely by score averages on unreliable tests. The second represents an idea that is disconnected from reality and empirical evidence regarding the complexities of college pathways and choices. When you spoke to and interviewed all the participants in your study, and you work through some of the big misconceptions about Asian American college applicants, I wondered how you took up the more recent executive order on indoctrinating K-12 students and the reference to SFFA in the Dear Colleague letter that was issued from the Department of Education on February 14th, how some of the misconceptions you've addressed in your book and through the interviews you conducted played out in terms of what you saw them being reproduced or not in the language that was used in those the executive order and the Dear Colleague letter. Did you see evidence of the misconceptions you took up or discovered in your interviews with your with your participants? Evidence.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine with my participants, like having spent so much time with them, I think the policy opponents, the affirmative action opponents, would be horrified with what they're seeing right now, because there was like this element of cultural pride. And so a lot of them were like, yeah, I would love to see Asian American studies in K-12, right? So, and we've been seeing that in places like Texas and Florida, where you've got folks who identify as Asian American who were like, oh, affirmative action is absolutely terrible. And then turn right around and say, like, we're fighting for Asian American history in K-12, right? So there's these contradictions and deep misunderstandings. And I think when it comes to the Trump administration, what they're doing with these executive orders is they're relying on the majority of the people in this country to to fall right into pits of racial stereotypes, right? Like fall into these traps of racial illogics, right? To just let their brains slip into, oh, non-Asian minorities are just not academically, you know, they're not talented, right? And it just really goes to the deepest and the darkest racist eugenic stereotypes, right? Ideologies. And they're counting on us not to push back. And so I think it's really important that we all push back. And so the folks that I talked to who were opposed to affirmative action, they weren't opposed to, like, they recognize racism as a problem and they want to see it solve. I, you know, I don't disagree with them that the admission systems that we have in this country are broken, right? Like you may have seen this kid in the Bay Area, I think his name's Stanley Jong, who's suing the University of California. He went to Gunn High School in Palo Alto. He's got a job at Google. He's a Nepo baby, by the way. You know, and he got into Texas A&M, but he didn't get into the UCs. He didn't get into a bunch of Ivies he applied to. But we just assume, oh, his grades were so high and his test scores were so high. It must be because the UC is practicing racially discriminatory practices. Then how do you explain to me that over the last 10 years, Asian American numbers in the UC continue to increase? How do you explain to me that all students of color numbers in the UC have increased and the only population that is declining in enrollment is white? Why is Stanley playing the part of racial mascot?
Mm.
It's really disheartening, to say the least.
In chapter 4,
Sure, he's disappointed and sorry, Stanley, you didn't get into like your dream school, but we don't make policies on N of 1. We have not seen the rest of his file, right?
Yeah.
We don't know the totality of his file for admission.
Yeah. In chapter 4, if not me, then who? You speak to some of the anti-DEI, anti-affirmative action perspectives, and you say, make sure I got the right page here. Yeah, as I listened to them, I realized they were not unthinking racial props for white affirmative action opponents. They were thoughtful and deeply invested in their efforts to advocate for what they understood to be Asian American rights. In general, they were invested in improving the social status of Asian Americans. I'm now on the bottom of page 106, if there are those following along. Improving the social status of Asian Americans, and they resented the ways policy debates about race and education felt dismissive of their struggles and experiences. No Twitter exchange or news media clip could fully represent the complexities of their thinking. I learned that our differences live and evolve in how we have come to view the world's social problems and our divergent political investments. And I just wondered, from these experiences interviewing your participants, did something change in the way you thought about and talked about race-conscious policies as a result of conducting this work?
I think it's you know, I'm still thinking about it, and several of the opponents actually said, I'm actually for affirmative action. I just don't like how this is being, you know, how I think it's being implemented. And I think that you know, as I started out with the presentation, as I said, I feel like we need to reclaim the language of segregation and resegregation and desegregation and integration. Like, who is it? What is our vision collectively of who belongs in higher education, who belongs in our public life and leadership? And I feel like that is a start to getting clear on how to get back on the offensive and not just defensive, right? Like if we can, so I visited South Africa for the first time last year and, you know, visited a lot of historical apartheid sites and saw it up front and personal. And I can't help but think, right, that this is actually what we're descending into is much more of an apartheid state than, you know, and it's uncomfortable to talk about this, but quite frankly, I feel like we need to face up to the ugly truth of some of what we're seeing and get
Well,
clear on that to fight back.
we have, we're just at the top of the hour, Dr. Poon. Would you mind staying on a few more minutes? We have 3 questions in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Wonderful. So the first question is from Nelson, who asks, you mentioned earlier that it is time for us to take a more offensive approach during this political climate. What can that look like? How can institutions adopt a more proactive stance to ensure accessibility and protect minoritized students while balancing political pressure?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this in Illinois, so I'll bring that example to bear. I know that there's, and I think this bears across the country as well, applies across the country, is there are institutions with wealthy resources that can defend and push back through lawsuits. Will they do that? I don't know, right? And then you have the regional post-secondary institutions. I'm thinking places like here in Illinois, Eastern Illinois, Western Illinois, Southern Illinois, Northern Illinois, right? Like they're not the flagship, and they are underfunded. And this is a decades-long project of defunding public higher education, and public education more broadly, right? These institutions are so weakened with such few resources that they won't be able to withstand a long, you know, if the administration actually does pull the plug on federal funding, how will they survive? I don't think they can survive individually, but how do we have institutions band together? Because I still feel like a lot of post-secondary institutions, even regional public, still think of each other as competition rather than as, more allies. And I'm speaking from the context of Illinois, where we don't have a governing board across the state. And it's much more of a coordinated board for the state. And so there's got to be a way to come together and pool resources to defend. Now, the private institutions, I have another question for, because I'm thinking about Northwestern, whose board of trustees is like not very uninterested in defending their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And perhaps many of their board of trustee members are more than happy to do away with those investments. And so I think places like that certainly require a lot of on the ground mobilization and holding all these stakeholders coming together and holding these institutions accountable. I think we need to I was just talking to a colleague yesterday about, we have to take it back to doing teach-ins. Like, how many of us as faculty really fully understand the shared governance system or participate? I mean, some of it is weakened, yes, certainly.
Yeah.
But it's still something that so few of us actually participate in or even understand how to leverage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boone. We got another question for those you. This is from let's see, Nayu Lung, who asks, for those you interviewed that opposed affirmative action, were there any data gathered on their understanding and or knowledge on the history of civil rights or the history of the education system in the United States? And we saw, like in your interviews, there was some evidence that those who supported it had some knowledge of the history of racism.
Yeah. So the supporters, as I talk about, all of them had been exposed to some kind of ethnic studies or women and gender studies curriculum in college, or if not in college, then in their professional affinity spaces. So there was a lawyer I interviewed, and he, participated in, for the first time, an Asian Pacific American Bar Association event, and it took him a while to actually go, but when he went, he was like, oh my gosh, like this whole different view. Like, he was like, I have this language now that I didn't have before. So it doesn't have to be formal educational settings necessarily. They can be informal learning spaces, like at professional associations. For the opponents, they had very superficial understanding of the history of education and inequalities and race and racism. It was their understanding was very much, what is racism? Like, that was actually one of my questions. What is racism? And, almost all of the opponents basically said, it's just, this interpersonal calling me a slur, and there was no real systemic analysis.
Thank you. So, and one more question from Angela Chong, who asks, how do we create an offensive strategy to address the growing problem of misinformation among Asian immigrant groups, specifically Chinese immigrants and other immigrants with historical fears of communist terror? That seems to be a far-right strategy for mobilization.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. One of the things that I did learn is that there are, so I talk a lot in the book about something called WeChat. And at the time when I was doing the interviews in 2016, I was like, what is WeChat? But now it's grown into this huge social media platform for the Chinese diaspora around the world. And so that's for the Chinese diaspora. I know Koreans talk about Kakao Talk. My mother-in-law, who's Thai, uses Line. So there's all these fragmented echo chambers. My Indian friends talk about WhatsApp, which is also like my Hong Konger relatives use WhatsApp as well, right? So there's all these fragmented spaces, which is, again, not totally unlike mainstream social media problems of misinformation. I think the difference is that there's very little engagement among the diaspora to go outside of these echo chambers for information. But at the same time, there are what I was calling social justice warriors in those spaces too. So I feel like places like organizations like Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco, they started investing in community organizers that were in those spaces, who were trusted people. Because yes, I identify as Chinese, but I'm also Hong Konger diaspora. I'm not going to get into, I also don't read or write in Chinese. So in WeChat, you have to read and write Chinese. I don't, right? So I'm not a cultural native in those spaces. Whereas Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco started investing in a program and project where they were engaging in those spaces in WeChat as digital natives. And so that has seen a little bit of progress. But then unfortunately, when you started seeing progress with some of these folks, social justice warrior work in places like WeChat shut them down. Right, because WeChat is a company in mainland China, and Beijing's government has still a big fingerprint in WeChat. So I think there's got to be an engaging and intergenerational engaging and connection that really needs to be reconnected. Because I expected, honestly, when I went into talking with these people that were in disagreement with me, I thought I was going to be really annoyed, but I really enjoyed getting to know these people and just listening to them. And it gave me some hope to really just sit there and listen, have a research protocol, and just like, I'm not here to win anything. I just want to get to know you. Tell me about your life. Like, how did you arrive here? What was your path there? Right. And it felt very different than a lot of our political rhetoric today, which is just, how do I win this argument? Maybe winning shouldn't be like the first priority centered goal, but just like rehumanizing each other should be. Which is a long-term project, which is why I brought up that Korean Community Center and Minji's story about how long it took. It took years, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Poon. I think that's really strong that we want to stop thinking about how to win. We are, at the end of the day, we are all human, just want to listen each other and then to see where we are at. I think that's a really powerful message, especially what we need under this circumstance. So Dr. Poon, thank you so much for sharing your insight on the complexity of Asian American identity, also racial justice issue with the various rich examples that you have. On behalf of USC Race and Equity Center, we thank everyone for joining us this evening. And if you haven't already, please pick up a copy of Dr. Poon's book from Beacon Press. Thank you so much for everyone to joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Poon. Thank you, Dr. Kwan. Thank you, everyone who joined us from across the country. And we appreciate you for advancing equity in your organizations. And please, please, please pick up a copy of this very important book. Use it, share it with your colleagues, sign it in your classes. It will make a difference in your understanding and the use of evidence to clear up misconceptions, misinformation. Thank you so much, Dr. Poon, for your contribution.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Poon.
you.